Somewhere in southeastern Turkey, a stone pillar stands in a pit that took 12,000 years to open. It has a face, not a symbol, not an abstract carving, a face with eyes, and a presence that stops archaeologists mid-sentence when they describe it. You've heard of Göbekli Tepe, the discovery that rewrote human prehistory. What you probably haven't heard is that 46 kilometers away, something older, larger, and more architecturally sophisticated has been waiting, and the people who found it are only now beginning to understand what they're looking at. There is a version of human history that most of us absorbed without questioning it. It goes like this. For most of our existence, hundreds of thousands of years, human beings were nomads, hunters, gatherers, people who followed animals and seasons, who built nothing permanent, who left almost no trace. Then, roughly 6,000 years ago, something changed. People began farming. Farming led to surplus. Surplus led to settlement. Settlement led to cities. Cities led to specialization. Priests, soldiers, architects, scribes. And from that specialization came monuments, temples, writing, civilization. It's a clean sequence, logical, satisfying. And for most of the 20th century, the archaeological evidence seemed to support it. The earliest complex societies we could point to, Sumer, Egypt, the Indus Valley, all emerged within that 6,000-year window. Everything before that was, by definition, simple. Then came 1994. A German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt was surveying limestone hills near the town of Şanlıurfa in southeastern Turkey. Local farmers had reported strange stones protruding from the earth for decades. Surveys in the 1960s had dismissed them as medieval grave markers and moved on. Schmidt didn't move on. What he found beneath the surface were T-shaped limestone pillars, some of them nearly 6 meters tall, weighing up to 20 tons, arranged in precise circular enclosures. Carved into the stone were animals rendered with a naturalism and skill that had no business existing at this point in history. Foxes, vultures, scorpions, aurochs, each one executed with a confidence that suggested not an early attempt at art, but a mature artistic tradition. The site was called Göbekli Tepe, Potbelly Hill. Carbon dating placed its construction at approximately 12,000 years before the present. That's around 10,000 BCE, 6,000 years before Stonehenge, 4,000 years before the earliest cities of Mesopotamia. At a time when, according to the accepted model, human beings were not yet capable of organized large-scale construction. The archaeological world did not react with immediate celebration. It reacted with something closer to discomfort. Because Göbekli Tepe didn't just push the timeline back, it inverted the logical sequence entirely. Here was monumental religious architecture, requiring coordinated labor, planning, and symbolic thinking, built by people who showed no evidence of agriculture. No grain storage, no permanent housing. These were, by all other indicators, hunter-gatherers, which meant the conventional model had it backwards. It wasn't that civilization produced temples. It may have been that temples, the impulse toward shared ritual, toward collective symbolic meaning, produced civilization. The monument came first. Everything else followed. That single reversal, if it holds, changes the fundamental story of what human beings are and how we organize ourselves. Klaus Schmidt spent the rest of his life excavating Göbekli Tepe. He died in 2014, with only a fraction of the site uncovered. Current estimates suggest that less than 5% of the total structure has been excavated. The rest remains underground, protected, for now, by the same soil that preserved it for 12 millennia. Göbekli Tepe became, and remains, one of the most discussed archaeological discoveries in modern history. UNESCO World Heritage status, international media coverage. A site that appeared on the cover of major science magazines and generated hundreds of peer-reviewed papers. The world had found its rewriter of history, but here is what almost no one covered. While archaeologists were still processing the implications of Göbekli Tepe, while the academic community was slowly, reluctantly revising its models, 46 kilometers to the east, something else had already been found, something that had been sitting in plain sight, unreported, underfunded, and almost entirely unknown to the general public. For decades. While the world was learning the name Göbekli Tepe, the site that may ultimately prove more significant was waiting 46 kilometers to the east. It had been detected as early as 1997. Full excavation didn't begin until 2019. What they found when they started digging, no one was prepared for. The man who first noticed it was not leading a major international expedition. His name is Bahattin Çelik, a Turkish archaeologist conducting regional surveys in the late 1990s, methodically documenting the landscape around Şanlıurfa. In 1997, Çelik observed limestone pillars breaking through the surface of a hill the locals called Göbekli Tepe, Goat Hill. He noted their presence, he documented what he could see. And then, as so often happens in archaeology when resources are scarce and more prominent sites are competing for attention, Karahan Tepe entered a kind of institutional limbo. Known, catalogued, unexcavated. For over 2 decades, it waited. This is not unusual in archaeology. There are hundreds of known sites around the world that have been identified but not excavated, sometimes for lack of funding, sometimes for political or logistical reasons, sometimes simply because the queue of priorities is longer than the available resources. What makes Karahan Tepe unusual is what happened when the waiting finally ended. In 2019, a systematic excavation began under the direction of Professor Necmi Karul of Istanbul University, working within the broader framework of what would become known as the Taş Tepeler Project, Stone Hills, a coordinated Turkish initiative to investigate a cluster of prehistoric sites in the Şanlıurfa region that appeared to share architectural and symbolic characteristics with Göbekli Tepe. The first seasons were careful and methodical. The team worked with the precision that the site demanded, documenting stratigraphy, collecting samples, mapping the surface architecture. And then, layer by layer, Karahan Tepe began to reveal itself. The initial expectation, reasonable given what was known, was that this would be a site comparable to Göbekli Tepe, a related monument, a regional variation on a known theme, perhaps a satellite site, or a slightly later imitation of the same architectural tradition. That expectation did not survive contact with the evidence. Within the first systematic excavations, the team had identified more than 250 stone pillars, many still partially buried, many more suggested by ground-penetrating radar surveys of the surrounding area. For context, Göbekli Tepe, after decades of excavation, has yielded approximately 200 pillars across its known enclosures. Karahan Tepe had that many, and more, in its initial exposed areas alone.
But raw numbers were not the most significant finding. What began to distinguish Karahan Tepe from anything previously known was not its scale. It was its nature. The pillars at Göbekli Tepe are remarkable for their animal carvings and their monumental scale. They represent an extraordinary achievement. But they are, in a specific sense, abstract. The T-shape is architectural. The animals are symbolic. The structures communicate meaning through imagery, through representation. At Karahan Tepe, something different was happening. The pillars were not just carrying symbols. In some cases, the pillars were the figures. Carved directly into the stone, not applied as decoration, but emerging from the body of the pillar itself, were human forms. Arms. Hands with fingers. In one extraordinary case, a phallus. These were not representations of humans placed near the structure. These were the structure. The architectural element and the human body had been made inseparable. The cognitive implication of that distinction took time for the excavation team to fully articulate. Because what it suggests is a level of symbolic integration, a capacity to merge the functional and the representational into a single unified object that archaeologists had not previously associated with this period of human prehistory. This was not primitive art finding its legs. This was a mature symbolic vocabulary. In the eastern section of the Karahan Tepe excavation, the team uncovered a chamber. It is called, in the academic literature, the Pillar Shrine. And that name, functional as it is, does not fully prepare you for what it represents. The chamber is semi-subterranean, partially cut into the bedrock, partially constructed above it. This combination of techniques, cutting down into the earth while simultaneously building upward, suggests an intentional relationship between the structure and the landscape. These builders were not simply placing a monument on the ground. They were embedding it. Within the chamber, 11 T-shaped pillars are arranged in a precise configuration around a central figure. The central figure is itself a pillar, but one that has been carved with a degree of anthropomorphic detail that sets it apart from anything at Göbekli Tepe or any other known Neolithic site. Consider what anthropomorphic detail means in this context. We are not talking about a vague suggestion of human form. We are talking about a carved representation that includes hands with articulated fingers pressed against the body, a posture that researchers have described as self-referential, or possibly ritual. The figure appears aware of itself. It has a relationship with its own body that implies a specific, intentional meaning. And then, in the excavation season of 2021, during what would become one of the most significant seasons in the history of the project, the team uncovered something that stopped them. A T-pillar. The standard form. The architectural unit that defines this entire tradition. The shape that appears across every related site in the region. This one had a face. Not suggested. Not implied by positioning or context. A face. Carved into the upper section of the pillar, into what would, on a human body, be the head. Eyes. A nose. A mouth. Features rendered with an economy of line that speaks to total artistic confidence. For the excavation team, this was a conceptual threshold. The T-pillars at Göbekli Tepe have long been interpreted as stylized human figures, the horizontal bar of the T representing shoulders, the vertical shaft representing the body. It was a reasonable inference, supported by the arm carvings on some pillars. But it remained an inference. An interpretation. A hypothesis about intention. At Karahan Tepe, the builders had removed all ambiguity. They had put a face on it. What this means for our understanding of the T-pillar tradition is significant. If the pillars are confirmed to be anthropomorphic figures, representations of specific beings, whether human, ancestral, or divine, then the structures that contain them are not simply ceremonial spaces. They are gatherings. Assemblies of presences. Rooms full of figures who, from the perspective of the people who built them, were in some sense there. The ritual implications of that shift are considerable. Professor Nick Carroll, speaking to journalists following the 2021 season, was measured in his language as archaeologists tend to be when the evidence begins to outpace the interpretive frameworks. He described the site as revealing a new world we did not know. That restraint, from someone who has spent years working within this material, communicates more than enthusiasm would. Now, let's pause here and ask the question that the evidence is beginning to force. We know that hunter-gatherers built Göbekli Tepe. We know this because the faunal remains at the site, the bones, the food debris, show a diet based entirely on wild animals and gathered plants. There is no domesticated grain. No evidence of agriculture. These were mobile people who came together, for reasons we still don't fully understand, to build something that required enormous collective effort and sustained organizational capacity. The same appears to be true at Karahan Tepe. But here is where the picture becomes more complicated and more interesting. The faunal analysis from Karahan Tepe, still ongoing, has begun to produce data that doesn't fit cleanly into either the pure hunter-gatherer model or the early agricultural model. There are indicators, disputed, preliminary, but present, of dietary patterns that suggest either proto-domestication of certain species, or a more complex relationship between mobility and settlement than the standard model allows. In other words, these people may not have fit neatly into any of the categories we have built to describe them. Which is, of course, the pattern. Every time we excavate a site from this period with sufficient rigor, the categories bend. What doesn't bend, what the physical evidence at Karahan Tepe makes increasingly difficult to dismiss, is the level of cognitive and organizational sophistication we are looking at. To cut a semi-subterranean chamber from bedrock. To transport and erect multi-ton limestone pillars. To carve a human face into stone with the precision and intentionality visible in the Karahan Tepe examples, these are not the activities of a cognitive infrastructure that we have been trained to associate with this moment in prehistory. And yet here they are. The evidence does not ask for our permission to exist. What does it mean that these people we have spent a century calling primitive, were capable of this, not just capable, compelled? They didn't have to build this. They chose to. That choice tells us something. We just haven't agreed yet on what. By 2023, Karahan Tepe had generated enough academic attention to begin appearing in specialized archaeological publications with some regularity. Not mainstream coverage, the site remained largely unknown outside of professional circles and the subset of the general public that follows prehistoric archaeology closely. But within those circles, the conversations were shifting. The excavation seasons of 2024 and 2025 produced findings that accelerated that shift considerably. Among the most significant were a series of three-dimensional sculptures, freestanding carved figures recovered from contexts that placed them firmly within the site's primary occupation period. These are not relief carvings on pillars. These are sculptures in the round. Objects that were created to exist independently in space, to be seen from multiple angles, to occupy a room the way a person occupies a room. The technical skill involved is not in question. What is in question, and what is generating genuine debate among researchers, is what these objects were for. What role they played in whatever rituals, whatever social functions, whatever cosmological framework animated this place 12,000 years ago. We don't know. And the researchers who are most familiar with the material are the first to say so. What we can say carefully, with the appropriate qualifications, is that the presence of freestanding sculpture at this date implies a tradition of object-making that extends beyond utility. These objects serve no practical function. They exist entirely within the realm of meaning. Which means the people who made them had developed a relationship with the concept of meaning itself, with the idea that certain objects, certain forms, carry significance beyond their physical properties. That is, by any reasonable definition, an abstract cognitive capacity. And it is present here, fully formed, 12,000 years ago. In 2025, the excavation team also made public the results of expanded dietary and isotopic analysis studies of bone chemistry and plant remains that offer a window into how the people associated with Karahan Tepe actually lived. The results complicated the existing picture in ways that researchers are still working to interpret. The short version, the dietary signature doesn't match the expected profile for either mobile hunter-gatherers or settled early farmers. There are indications of a more varied, more managed food system than either model predicts, possibly including early, informal cultivation of certain plant species alongside continued reliance on hunted game. If that interpretation holds under further scrutiny, it suggests something important, that the transition from foraging to farming was not a sudden switch. Not a revolution. But a long, gradual, regionally variable process during which people were simultaneously hunters and proto-farmers, mobile and semi-settled, ancient and modern in ways that resist clean categorization. Karahan Tepe may be giving us a window into that transition, not from before or after, but from within it. Now, Karahan Tepe does not stand alone. 30 kilometers to the west lies Seberk, another site within the Taş Tepeler Project, excavated beginning in 2021. At Seberk, researchers have found carved relief panels of extraordinary quality, including a scene that depicts a human figure surrounded by animals in a composition that some researchers have described as narrative. Not symbolic arrangement. Not isolated images. A scene. Something happening. A moment in time, captured in stone. The same artistic sensibility. The same symbolic vocabulary. The same technical confidence. The implication is significant. Karahan Tepe and Seberk were not independent developments. They were part of a shared cultural world. People or ideas, or both, were moving between these sites. There was contact. Influence. Something that, in later periods, we would have no hesitation calling a civilization. This is the word that researchers are beginning, carefully, to use. Not a temple. Not an isolated monument. Not an anomaly. A civilization. The Taş Tepeler Project, as of 2025, has identified at least 12 sites in the Şanlıurfa region sharing the architectural and symbolic characteristics of Göbekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe. 12. Of those 12, a small number have seen any significant excavation. The majority have been surveyed, documented, and, for lack of funding, for lack of personnel, for the simple arithmetic of archaeological resource allocation, left for later. Let that settle for a moment. We are potentially looking at a network of monumental sites spread across a region, connected by a shared symbolic tradition, active during the same broad period of which we have examined a fraction. And from that fraction, we have already recovered findings that challenge the foundational model of human cognitive and social development. What is in the rest? The researchers who work at Karahan Tepe, the ones who spend their seasons in that excavation trench, who handle these objects, who read the stratigraphy, some of them have begun to say something in their publications that would have been professionally risky to say a decade ago. That what they are looking at is not a temple. It is the remains of a civilization. One that we have barely begun to find. At this point, a question becomes unavoidable. If Karahan Tepe is larger than Göbekli Tepe, more architecturally sophisticated than Göbekli Tepe, potentially older than Göbekli Tepe, and part of a network of related sites that suggests a regional civilization rather than an isolated phenomenon, why does almost no one know it exists? The honest answer involves several factors, none of them conspiratorial, all of them worth examining. The first is sequencing. Göbekli Tepe had a 40-year head start. It was excavated by a high-profile international team with institutional backing from the German Archaeological Institute. It generated publications, documentary coverage, and mainstream attention throughout the 1990s and 2000s, building a media presence that Karahan Tepe, a newer excavation, a Turkish-led project, operating with significantly more limited international exposure, simply hasn't had time to match. The second factor is funding. Archaeological excavation at this scale requires sustained financial support. The Taş Tepeler Project operates with Turkish government backing, which is meaningful and has enabled real progress. But the international funding networks that amplify a site's global profile, the foundations, the university partnerships, the documentary commissions, have been slower to engage with Karahan Tepe than the significance of its findings arguably warrants. The third factor is language. The most detailed and current reporting on Karahan Tepe exists primarily in Turkish-language academic and journalistic contexts. The international archaeology press has covered the site, but not with the sustained attention that Göbekli Tepe received. For an English-speaking audience, which remains the primary driver of global archaeological media, Karahan Tepe has been, in practical terms, nearly invisible. And the fourth factor, the one that is perhaps most interesting from a historical perspective, is timing. Göbekli Tepe arrived at a moment when the archaeological community and the general public were both ready for a paradigm shift. The site's discovery in the mid-1990s coincided with a broader cultural openness to revising the story of Hum. So, what do we actually know? Let's be precise. Because precision, the discipline of separating what the evidence shows from what we wish it showed, is the only thing that separates serious archaeology from speculation dressed in stone. We know that at Karahan Tepe, in the Sanliurfa region of southeastern Turkey, human beings constructed a complex of monumental stone architecture approximately 12,000 years ago. That date is established by radiocarbon analysis of organic material recovered from primary contexts at the site. It is not disputed by mainstream archaeology. We know that the builders of this site created T-shaped limestone pillars, some of which carry anthropomorphic carvings of a sophistication and intentionality without parallel at any other known site from this period. The pillar with a carved human face is not a matter of interpretation. It exists. It has been photographed, analyzed, and published in peer-reviewed literature. We know that the pillar shrine, the semi-subterranean chamber with 11 pillars arranged around a central anthropomorphic figure, represents an architectural form with no known precedent. Not at Göbekli Tepe. Not anywhere else. We know that freestanding sculpture was produced at this site. That dietary evidence suggests a complex, transitional subsistence pattern. That Karahan Tepe is connected to at least one other site, Sayburk, by a shared symbolic and artistic tradition. And that at least 12 similar sites exist in the region, most of them unexcavated. These are facts. Supported by evidence. Accepted by the researchers working most closely with the material. Now, what don't we know? So, what do we actually know? Let's be precise. Because precision, the discipline of separating what the evidence shows from what we wish it showed, is the only thing that separates serious archaeology from speculation dressed in stone. We know that at Karahan Tepe, in the Sanliurfa region of southeastern Turkey, human beings constructed a complex of monumental stone architecture approximately 12,000 years ago. That date is established by radiocarbon analysis of organic material recovered from primary contexts at the site. It is not disputed by mainstream archaeology. We know that the builders of this site created T-shaped limestone pillars, some of which carry anthropomorphic carvings of a sophistication and intentionality without parallel at any other known site from this period. The pillar with a carved human face is not a matter of interpretation. It exists. It has been photographed, analyzed, and published in peer-reviewed literature. We know that the pillar shrine, the semi-subterranean chamber with 11 pillars arranged around a central anthropomorphic figure, represents an architectural form with no known precedent. Not at Göbekli Tepe. Not anywhere else. We know that freestanding sculpture was produced at this site. That dietary evidence suggests a complex, transitional subsistence pattern. That Karahan Tepe is connected to at least one other site, Sayburk, by a shared symbolic and artistic tradition. And that at least 12 similar sites exist in the region, most of them unexcavated. These are facts. Supported by evidence. Accepted by the researchers working most closely with the material. Now, what don't we know? We don't know who these people were in the sense that matters most, not genetically, though ancient DNA analysis may eventually tell us something, but culturally. We don't know what they believed. We don't know the name they called themselves, if they had one. We don't know the language they spoke. We don't know how they governed themselves, or whether they did. We don't know the social structures that made the construction of a site like this possible. We don't know why the site was deliberately buried. And that last point deserves attention. Because Karahan Tepe, like Göbekli Tepe, shows evidence of intentional backfill, the deliberate covering of the structures with soil and rubble at some point after their primary period of use. This was not abandonment. This was interment. The builders, or their successors, chose to bury what they had made. Why? We don't know. The theories range from ritual closure, a deliberate ending of the site's sacred function, to practical reuse of the landscape, to responses to climate change in the region during this period, to social disruption of a kind that left no other material trace. Each of these theories is possible. None of them is proven. And the honest position is that this particular question, one of the most humanly resonant questions the site raises, may not be answerable with the evidence currently available. That uncertainty is not a failure of archaeology. It is a record of what was lost. We tend to think of ancient mysteries as things that happened in the distant past, events or peoples or civilizations that existed long enough ago that their absence from the historical record feels natural, expected. Of course, we don't know everything about 12,000-year-old people. Of course, there are gaps. But the gaps at Karahan Tepe are not simply gaps in the record. They are gaps between what we assumed was possible and what the physical evidence shows was achieved. That is a different kind of gap.
The excavation at Karahan Tepe continues. New seasons bring new finds. The three-dimensional sculptures of 2024. The dietary analysis of 2025. Whatever 2026 holds. And the team has indicated that several unexplored areas of the site are being prioritized for the coming season. At least 11 of the 12 identified Taş Tepeler sites remain largely unexcavated. The landscape of southeastern Turkey, this improbable cradle of what may be the earliest complex human culture, still holds most of its secrets. Archaeologists have barely scratched the surface, literally. The hill they called Göbekli Tepe, Goat Hill, had been there for 12,000 years. Locals walked past it every day. The answer to one of history's greatest questions was hiding under a name that meant nothing. It usually does.